Good evening. My name is David Steiner. I'm the director here at the CUNY Institute for Education Policy. A very, very warm welcome to you all. We are delighted to see both new faces and old. We are particularly privileged this evening to welcome to Roosevelt House one of America's most distinguished sociologists, Annette Lareau. I have made a habit of not reading bios because I actually believe the audience can read. And there's nothing duller than having me read what you can read. So let me just say that our guest has been one of the most thoughtful, one of the most profound, one of the finest scholars of the family, of choice, of the ways in which different kinds of social structures work to delimit, open, shape, choice, lifestyle. And it really is a personal privilege, if I may say so, to welcome you here. We have with us also my colleague, Joe Vitoridi, who will respond to the remarks. Joe has been studying school choice since I knew him, which is a long time ago, knows as much about it, particularly in New York City, as anyone alive. And I think really brings a very rare combination of outstanding scholarship with real-world knowledge about how politics works. And part of the difficulty we often face in education policy is a divide between those two worlds. The academics and the policymakers rarely mix in productive and useful ways, so we want to try to change that. So without further ado, let me invite Annette to make some remarks, and then we'll have Joe respond, and then the three of us will have a conversation, and as always, we will open it up to the floor. Please.
Thank you so much for that warm and gracious introduction. It's a really great pleasure to be here. City University of New York is really one of the great public institutions in the United States of America. It's an institution which warmly welcomes people from all walks of life, provides opportunities for upward mobility, has an eminent faculty, a great sociology department, and great students. A lot of people, some of my favorite people in the world have graduated from Hunter College. And even my mom grew up in quite a poor family in the Bronx, and my Aunt Evelyn went to Hunter, and when it was Hunter High School. And so it's a pleasure to be here. And thanks to all of Ashley and to Kelly for all the work in bringing me here. So school choice is really a very prominent issue in American society. It's grown in importance over the last 3 decades. And in many ways has captured the educational agenda in a way that few people foresaw in the late 1970s. And often it's framed as an individualistic matter. There's no doubt that schools have important consequences for children's life chances. I think there's no doubt that parents believe that schools matter and are consequential. And yet, school choice is often framed as really, it's up to parents to gather information. The No Child Left Behind policy has been crucial in emphasizing the importance of spreading information about test scores. We have a lot of time and energy in schools that's going to produce test scores, allegedly so that this information can go up on the website and then parents can use it to choose schools. And I've done a research project with Elliot Weiniger, and Kim Goyette and I have published this book, Choosing Homes, Choosing Schools. It's an edited collection I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight. And we really found that most of the key assumptions, we just couldn't find empirical evidence to support them. And, and that's what I want to share with you. There's a lot of variability. And what we found for many, but not all, parents, certainly not parents in New York City or in other large cities, but in the suburbs, and still some parents in New York City. Once parents choose a home, they have more or less chosen a school. And so really, school policy is housing policy. It's not really only about school choice. And to varying degrees, parents think about schools when they choose housing, and sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. So that we need to think a little bit about this intersection of neighborhoods and schools in a way that has been, I think, underemphasized in the literature, since school choice is often framed in a highly individualistic way. We look at, do parents apply? Did they go to magnet schools, go to here? What kind of information they have? How many schools do they apply for? And I think we're missing part of the picture in the way we have thought about school choice. And so the research question was, how do parents of young children decide where to live? It was a group of researchers who were in this endeavor, and Kimberly Goyette, I think, has a very thoughtful overview in the book, where she really shows that it's really, it's so easy for people to be in different silos in educational research. And so there's research on residential segregation and how that's declined somewhat, but not entirely, particularly in the suburbs, by race. School segregation, which means very high, particularly by race, but also by economic issues. Housing choice, where there's a lot of research showing, in fact, housing remains highly segregated by race and also by economic issues, and if anything, that's increasing over time, and then the literature on school choice. And so we're trying to help broaden the conversation in a different way. And of course, it goes without saying that school choice is a potpourri of not just private schools and vouchers and magnet schools, and there's intra-district transfers, which means transfers within school districts, transfers across school districts, and a few people are in homeschooling. And so we find that people have preferences, but then these preferences are often deeply constrained. Like Mary Patillo, who is at Northwestern, has a great chapter in the book about Chicago. And the Chicago School District has the nerve to have this website that says it's 1, 2, 3. You gather information, you submit an application, and you find out, And then she describes these people who their schools are closed and they apply and their application gets lost, and it turns out they're redirected to another school where there's not busing for it, that the project is total chaos. And as we found also in our large Northeastern School District, which shall go nameless, as I'm going to explain tonight, the process is far from clear, and often you need formidable informal knowledge, and even then you do not. Parents who are very rich in what I would call cultural capital, specialized cultural knowledge and skills, encounter failure as they try to secure a high-quality kindergarten for their children. And so I believe that the role of information is complex, that often people actually don't really use the information that's available to them, and the power of parents is overstated. Because really, schools choose students. It's not really that parents choose schools. Schools have to admit students, and often parents are rejected from their first choice charter school or public school or elementary school. And so in the book, just to give you a taste of it, we try to be thoughtful and think about who has thought about the relevant issues. And so we do take seriously this research on residential and school segregation and housing decisions. Then we have how do people choose houses. And for example, the Rhodes and DeLuca chapter is in Mobile, Alabama, and it's a study of poor families. And some people have landlords, and there's water coming in through the roof, and they have to move. And they found really in that sample that people normally didn't think about schools, partly because they considered the schools to be relatively comparable to one another. And so the degree to which people actually think about schooling is often overstated. And then we have chapters on school choice from Boston, the Kimmelberg chapter, Patillo, Chicago, and as well as a chapter on policy. And so these are the assumptions which I want to challenge in my talk today. The information is available and accessible. The information will be used, and it will be used in similar ways, and that there are few to no obstacles in realizing preferences. And we just, as I said, did not find empirical support for these widely shared assumptions. And I want to talk particularly about my own work, because I've done research on social class and how social class makes a difference in life chances. And in this book I wrote, Unequal Childhoods, I argued middle-class parents had a cultural logic of child-rearing which was different than that of the working-class parents. And using a gardening analogy, I said that the middle-class parents saw children as a project and engaged in concerted cultivation and tried to develop their talents and skills over and over again through enrolling them in organized activities, engaging in language use, and answering questions with questions, and intervening in institutions. And this created a sense of entitlement among the children. And because it was in sync with the standards of the school, it created advantages. So it's not as if one of these is better than the other, which I do not believe. And the accomplishment of natural growth, a lot of these working class parents had a high school degree or high school dropout, so it was very reasonable for them to depend on the educators to educate them. You know, if I needed brain surgery, God forbid, I would depend on the neurosurgeon to plan the surgery. I would not be trying to micromanage the neurosurgeon. Oh, you do it this way, right? And yet we expect our parents to be heavily involved in schools and essentially to manage teachers and to know structure and intervene in teachers' lives. And teachers often complain bitterly when working class parents and poor parents are not involved in school, misrecognizing that in fact the working class parents respect the teacher's professional expertise and depend on the educator to educate them. And so, but these different cultural logics of childbearing, which dominated daily life, and you would see middle-class mothers agonizing over what gymnastics team to put their children on, and whether or not to do what sleepaway camp to do. I started this project thinking that in the most economically consequential decision of their lives, buying a house, that the middle-class parents would engage in a lot of research. They would scour the map, they would consider the options, and they would collect a lot of research. And that turned out to be wrong. And I'm still surprised, actually. So this is the methods that I'm going to talk about in the study I'm going to talk about today. We did observations. We ended up getting into, quote unquote, the best school district in the large northeastern city. It would be similar, I think, to Greenwich, Connecticut, or something like that. It was widely considered to be one of the best school districts. And then from there, we went to 2 other school districts, including the school district right next to it and one not too far away. So the districts were only, because the area is relatively compact, they were only about half an hour from one another. And because of a quirk of fate, there are 105 school districts within an hour of City Hall in this particular area. So this is not Los Angeles where there's one massive school district. So people, if anyone's going to have school choice, these people have school choice. There's also, and so there are many school districts with 1 high school, 2 middle schools, and 4 elementary schools. And so we recruited families from this, and we started with the elementary schools, kindergartens, and you know, thank goodness I'd done other studies because these researchers the interviews were very flat. You know, what do you do in research? You need rich, detailed quotes and people telling you lots of detail what they did, and these people were like, oh, I asked around and they said it was good, so we came here. So then I sort of was like panicking, you know, what am I going to publish about this? And so I thought, well, maybe they're too old. So then we thought, well, try daycare. You know, maybe if they're younger, we'll get more. So then we went to daycares and we recruited people from there, et cetera. So the kids were mostly 3 to 11, but 7, but some were as old as 11. They were, half of the people were white, half of them were African American. I did about half the interviews, and we did additional interviews with other community and real estate agents in particular. So this gives you this, just Kingsley is this community, think King, right, is the best, considered the best school district. Gibbon is sort of a lower middle class school district, very close to it, very white. And then Warren is a multiracial district that turns out demographically is not that different than the city. When you go across the city line, you can't really tell the difference, but is a suburban school district. Okay. And this gives you a little bit of an overview of our sample, and you'll notice that I'm defining class position by people's education and their occupation. And people beat up with me a little bit on unequal childhoods. I had truncated the middle class, so I said, okay, we'll have an upper middle class and I'll work in a middle class. And at least we couldn't, I mean, we have a relatively small sample, we really couldn't see that much difference in how they interacted. And for that matter, even in the working class, everybody used networks. But as I'm going to show you in a second, their networks were segregated by class and by race. And so because their networks were segregated, they ended up in different schools. Okay, so the schools are different. The per pupil expenditure is different. The SAT scores are different. the number of poor kids is different, the test scores are different, and the home values are different. And people say, well, all I can show you is just the amount of money. After all, it costs the average home value is $485,000 in Kingsley. And that's certainly true, and you certainly get less house for your dollar in Kingsley than you do over the line at Gibbons. But nonetheless, there are houses, there are people in our study who bought houses in Kingsley for $150,000. So there is economic variability within each of these districts. But what turned out was that people mostly had never heard of these other districts, didn't even know the names of the districts, and had never considered the districts. In other words, they did not do, if you take a comparison, say how people apply to college, they do college tours, they look at the books, they do visits, and you could argue, I think, that kindergarten is certainly as important in kids' educational development as college, but we're not seeing a similar process, at least in this study. And I'm not saying there should be that process, but I think given how much people care about schools, I think it was surprising. And it also raises questions about the school choice. And so I have a paper with Elliot Weiniger, which we're calling Sleepwalking into Neighborhoods. And that really seemed to be what was going on, right? So at something like tonight, somebody's thinking about buying a house, they might talk to people, and people would say, oh, Greenwich has good schools, right? And often people begin to look at houses in Greenwich without ever checking the school district website, and check it often before they make an offer. And although there are surely many different communities around, including some that are more economically diverse and racially diverse, people narrow very closely, and then they start looking at kitchen cabinets. But the consequential decision, which neighborhood, appears to be extremely rapid and contingent on networks. Now, it would be foolish to say that, of course, social structure doesn't matter. I mean, I think this Ebola tragedy shows in crucial ways the powerful role of social structure in our lives and the way we all depend on social structure. And so roads, highways, public transportation, property taxes, businesses, real estate, all of this shaped the neighborhoods. And there were many policies that shaped the neighborhoods, and particularly tax policies, but also housing policies. And I think, as I'm going to say at the end, the way towards more, so the question is, how do we get more economically diverse schools? And school choice is not leading us in that direction. So I think we have to think about other options here. Okay. And so this, again, which the power of economics was very important, but I think it's insufficient to explain the outcomes that we observed. Okay. So people had these mental maps, and these mental maps appeared to be linked to what other people knew. We only found one person who really relied on test scores, and that person had no networks, or put differently, her live-in partner was who was a medical doctor, and he had come to be in a resident program, and he did not activate his potential future co-workers to ask them. And so instead she went to a website similar to greatschools.com, found the number 10 schools, looked up and went through it. But that was our one case. And that was not how it went for most people. Most people, even if they were relocators and they were coming from out of state, they went out to dinner when they were being recruited for a professional job. At the dinner, people told them where to live, and they got a real estate agent who was often recommended by somebody, a future coworker, and that real estate agent worked in a relatively narrow pocket of areas, neighborhoods. So once you'd chosen a real estate agent, generally you had chosen a neighborhood. And so this word of mouth, this inability or unwillingness to consider other neighborhoods was really very powerful. And so this mother, Ms. Waters, who was a psychologist and had an advanced degree, she was a mother who could have been in my book, Unequal Childhoods, but was not. She had 2 little kids, and that she was hovering around, and she had an older kid in soccer, and she volunteered in the PTA, and She had a kid 6 and 3, and she was worried that her kid who was 3, she said she requested the daycare center move him into, quote, a slightly more advanced group. So, quote, instead of being the oldest kid in the group, we wanted him to be among the youngest because we felt that our younger son is pretty developmentally advanced. And this request is turned down, but she had this sort of let no stone go unturned approach to child rearing. But in terms of the district where they bought their house, she said, well, we just felt like the public schools are pretty good here. And the question was, well, how did you know the schools were good in this neighborhood? I mean, it's just talked about, it's in the newspapers. We didn't really look up test scores or anything like that before we moved, but by reputation, word of mouth. I just feel like so much that I may be assuming the schools, some of my decisions are not like I've carefully researched. All right. Ms. Preston, a PhD scientist who was moving from University of Chicago, bought a house that was worth around $400,000. Their income was $200,000. And again, they sought energetically to give their son every advantage in life. She traveled extensively for her work, and her mother volunteered in the school. And again, it was sort of vague. We wanted to be somewhere near there were good public schools. We wanted some space. We wanted to minimize our commute. We looked in this area, and we need to be near a train. So none of this had to do with schools. And one thing, schools didn't really come into it, except from talking to people. Public schools here were very acceptable. And so she said, and at Lick School, I'm not you're asking, but it was sort of like Madison County or DeWitt County, but I don't even think my information that Madison County schools were better than DeWitt County was particularly solid. I'm a scientist. I know how to check things out. And the fact is I didn't do it. And so Mr. Quigley, who was African American and grown up in the schools, grown up in the district, he said the school district is one of the best. It just gets a lot of respect around the country. And he felt that Kingsley was light years away. And so there was just this taken for granted notion. Now, the working class parents also felt their schools were excellent. Their schools, in fact, were not making AYP, and the kids were not at grade level, but the mothers uniformly reported that the schools were excellent. And they said that the mother said she was extremely proud that she was not in the city. Talking about the city. The city, I would never put my child in a city school. They're raising themselves in the city. They're just too fast. I don't like the city. Nope, not at all. No, thank you. That would destroy my baby. So she was this pride that they were in the suburbs, in a suburban school was very important. And she just was assured that the schools were good. And the city process, the suburban process had this nonchalant, taken for granted air to it. The city process was different. People were losing sleep over this, particularly middle-class mothers. And charter schools had a halo. Every single city parent we talked to presumed that the charter schools were better than the public schools as a group. And again, they relied on friends and coworkers and relatives, and they, again, mostly did not use websites unless their networks were weak. And we had middle-class parents who applied for 14 schools in this, and this was an enormous enterprise for the city parents. And some of the parents used the word, mothers used the word harrowing to describe it. And there were only 4 to 6 public schools that were defined as viable. There were schools with higher test scores that were virtually all black that were not on parents' lists. And the number of white kids seemed to be very consequential in how middle-class white parents evaluated school quality. But we had some very highly educated parents who missed one piece of information. And so, for example, we had this Nicole Terra mother who had a degree from an Ivy League institution, had her kid in an elite daycare, and yet her kid was not only applied to the city transfer schools and didn't get in, and only really applied to one private school, and she was rejected. And she lost sleep. She had nightmares of a dinosaur, Tyrannosaurus Rex, eating her child. She gained 30 pounds. She thought about it every day. And because of financial issues, they couldn't sell their house and move to another house. She was adamant she was not moving to the suburbs. And so in the end, they put their kid in a disputed up-and-coming school she said he has the best kindergarten teacher in the district. And so you've had some parents who were just frantic over this process. And here, parents' informal knowledge was crucial because the district website was very complicated. Sometimes it was erroneous. People got misinformation, even from the schools. And so parents would talk about exchanging information and making mistakes, but then learning about how to go about it from other parents. And so that information was crucial. So this mother said, when I filled out the application, I didn't realize you're supposed to be realistic. You're supposed to put your first choice at what was first, what you could reasonably get into. So I thought it was supposed to list your order of preference. So I put number 1, West School, because if you're going to ask me, obviously, do I want to go to the kid in the school? That's where I want. Number 2, Brownside's the second best school in the city. And then I went down to be more realistic. I put Clayton as 3rd, and I put Ledford as 4th. And I later learned that in order to get your kid on Ledford, you have to put Ledford number 1. Some of the moms described it as trying to balance 2 prom dates in terms of trying to get in and negotiating with principals. Some people volunteered to try to make it. And working class parents also worried, and many parents also expressed a desire for religious school, but many went to neighborhood schools. Okay. This, I think, remarkable statistic in Phi Delta Kappa shows that only 19% of parents gave their school an A or B, but when asked to rate their oldest child's school, 77% gave their school an A or a B. And so generally, parents report that their kids are in excellent schools. And so the role of race is we found middle-class parents, if anything, our black middle-class parents were more assiduous in terms of actually looking at test scores and talking to interviewing principals, et cetera. But we found everybody used networks to guide them. Everybody relied on trusted people. And so the African-American families looked at all black communities, which white often excluded from their consideration. But, and African-American parents, especially middle-class parents, expressed concern about discrimination. But it wasn't like we found a different process for how people were going about it, right? And so the middle-class parents ended up in schools that would be considered better schools. But it was not because they worked harder, they did more research, or they expended effort in some ways. Rather, they had the fortune of being in networks that were guiding them to economically segregated places. And so working class parents were also in networks, and their networks were taking them somewhere else. And so really in a very quick decision, people were guided into neighborhoods, which ended up being enormously consequential for kids' school options. And these neighborhoods tended to be segregated by economic issues and also by racial issues. So intervening in this process is complex. I mean, if we could, the college search process is a longer, more elaborate process, and this decision-making isn't as rapid. So the question is, how do you intervene in this process? And I think that you really have to look at housing policy. You have to think about how do we make neighborhoods more economically diverse? How do we have places like Kingsley having low-income housing or middle-income housing? Because if you have those housing options, then you have a greater chance of having schools that are more economically diverse. Because as we look at the neighbor, and of course there are formidable policy challenges to that recommendation since it's a local issue. But I think we have to think more critically, but I think school choice is not the answer in terms of providing the outcomes that we anticipated, and that we, rather than framing as an individual parent decision, we have to look broader at housing and communities and networks to understand why we end up with the patterns that we see. Thank you very much.
I was invited by David to join the discussion tonight in the context of this very thick book that you have edited. And I've spent a lot of time with this book. And so my comments are going to focus mostly on the book. I know your comments here, and I saw your notes, actually included some of your other research, which I know is quite important and we can talk about later on tonight. What I'd like to do, what I'm going to do is make some general comments about the book. I'll make some nitpicking comments at the end, and then we can have a conversation. This book includes lots of data. There are 10 chapters chock full of data that have been put together by about 17 scholars. A lot of it updates information that we've already known, and I think it's important to do that. It's important to keep current. And obviously there's a lot of anxiety among you and your authors about the whole choice phenomenon, and we need to talk about that. What I also want to do is, I noticed you did not write a conclusion. I know what it's like to edit a book, and to try to put everything together at the end sometimes can be very challenging, but I'm going to push you a little tonight to tell us more about where you think we should go in a policy sense, because you've made some observations about choice and its impact or lack of impact, and I think you've left some questions open, so I'd like to discuss some of that. Let me make some general comments. Obviously, what the whole theme of this book is that schools and communities are unequal. I think we all know that. They're unequal in many ways in terms of housing stock, in terms of the quality of schools, in terms of the resources people have, in terms of economic status, income. We know that communities are racially segregated. New York, by the way, is one of the most highly segregated systems in the country. We know that the better off have better choices when we play the choice game, the same way they have better choices when we operate under the old system of less choice. The question in my mind is, does more choice lead to more opportunity or less opportunity? Whereas some would say, does it make things better or worse? You make a comment at the very beginning of the book, or an observation, about over 70% of people still go to neighborhood public schools. That's an important thing to keep in mind when we talk about choice, because whatever happens in choice in the next 10 years even, most kids will still go to neighborhood public schools. So we should never see this as a discussion of whether we should have choice or whether we should do something to improve neighborhood public schools. Because whatever we do, most kids are still going to be going to those schools. So to me, it's not an either-or thing. And having been involved in this discussion since, my first book on this was in 1999. I was 11 at the time. But there's a polarization in it, so you're either a cheerleader for one side or the other. And I don't think that's a good way to go about this conversation. I think we have to observe what we see and ask the bottom line question, what's best for the education of kids? And I would say that whatever we do to manipulate the system, poor people are still going to be worse off. There's no way around that. As I tell my students, it's always better to be rich than be poor. And they look at me as if to say, we knew that already. And that's going to happen no matter what we do from a policy perspective. So the question is, what can we do to move the system slightly even, slowly, to make things better? Choice is never a cure-all. Like anything else, whether it be more testing or less testing or community schools or whatever it is, there is no such thing as a magic bullet in education. If there were, somebody would have discovered it by now. Not all choice people are market advocates, I should say. I know there's a comment in the beginning of the book. Jack Koons, my friend from University of California, would never define himself as a market advocate. my book, Choosing Equality, was all about saying choice is about opportunity, not markets. So we need to kind of leave that piece behind also, and because there are very significant policy preferences that people have in the choice camp. I know that already sounds like a battle, about how to achieve choice most effectively. And there are real differences between the market folks and the opportunity folks. There's a real question raised in this book about the ability of parents to choose. It's not a new question. You very well have described how people go about choosing. Middle-class people who have better options choose neighborhoods. They don't choose schools. So it's no big gamble to move to Greenwich and say, whatever school in Greenwich my kid winds up with, it's going to be okay. Middle-class parents who can fit in certain areas of Greenwich would say the same thing. Once you have the ability to choose those communities, the question of which school is less compelling. Choice really takes place in those facilities, in those districts, urban districts, as you say, where we're beginning to see more options. And then parents can play the choice game. And there are all kinds of advantages and disadvantages to this. It has implications for neighborhood public schools, whether people are going to schools locally or not. And the point of it is that you very carefully show that people with more resources, who are better educated, who have more time, who have more leisure, have more of an opportunity to research things if they choose and make highly informed decisions. But we shouldn't conclude from that people who are less advantaged are incapable of making intelligent decisions. There was a book written in the year 2000, by Mark Schneider, Paul Teskey, and Marissa Marshall, who, it's 14 years old now. It was called Choosing Schools, and it was published by Princeton University Press. And they talked about the whole issue of this information disparity among parents. And I think only one of your authors mentioned that book, and it was a very important book. And some of them mentioned other work by those authors, but they missed the point. They gravitated toward the observation that families start this unequally when it comes to making choices and making decisions. And it was really about the ability, what we were really talking about then was the ability of parents to make good choices for their kids. What they did conclude, which was very important, is that while these parents, poorer parents, less advantaged parents, may not have the access to data that would help you know what the test scores are in your school, they looked at other things that helped them make decisions. They looked at the facility, and they saw if the facility looks like it's falling apart, that means nobody cares about that school. Probably don't want to send my kid there if I don't have to. They looked at things like safety. I mean, the parents in Greenwich don't really have to worry too much about safety when their kids go to school. But in inner city school districts, if your neighbor's kid got roughed up the day before, you've heard about it. And so these are the kinds of things that allows many parents who are less advantaged to make intelligent choices. And in the end, choice for them is a form of empowerment among people who have very little power. That, I think, is an important consideration of itself. One of the things that your authors don't deal with, but I think has to be part of the conversation and choice, has to do with what the market people will call the supply side. What we would say, are there a lot of good schools to choose from? You know, in New York, theoretically, everybody can choose what high school they go to. The problem, and there's been studies of it, and I've written about them, other people have written about them. The problem is there aren't that many good schools to choose from when you think of how many kids want to go there. So we really have, the issue is not about the limits of choice so much as the limits of the choices, which goes back to my point at the very beginning. Nothing works if you don't deal with those schools where 70% of the kids go to. There are other things we can talk about. We know that schools where poor people go have fewer resources, despite decades of litigation on school finance reform. If we really want to fix this, we have a system now where the privileged get more for their kids' education than the poor. There's something really wrong with that. It's not that it's not even equal. Equity lawsuits that have replaced equality lawsuits have come down to the conclusion, in the end, the rich are going to spend more. That's the way it goes. If you can't deal with that, then you have a very extraordinary problem to deal with when you're trying to equalize educational opportunities between suburban districts and urban districts. And we haven't done very much about it, really. Even if we do improve the number of, let's say, desirable schools that most parents would say, I could send my kid there, there are still going to be parents who will not be able to make good choices for their kids. Those left behind, pardon the term. That, to me, suggests that there's much more work to be done in the market. People will say, well, we'll replace those schools. They'll run out of business. What we need to do, really, is do something about those schools. Either we figure a way to fix them, to make them stronger schools, or close them down. I know that's something that lots of people want to avoid, but if you don't close them down, somebody's going to get stuck in them. And so I would start with, what are we going to do to fix them? We're having a conversation, maybe we're not having a conversation in New York now, about what do we do with failing schools? We know we don't want to close them. We're not sure what we want to do with them. That's a serious concern to mine. Whatever we do, we have to understand, unfortunately, that progress moves very slowly. Some changes not going to be, some of us have been at this for a while. Joyce was there when I started my career, so she's a witness to this. One of my first job working on the chancellor's staff at 110 Livingston Street, of all places. Remember that? And so for all the time we've been watching this, we've seen lots of changes. We haven't seen a whole lot of improvement. We've seen some improvements. And that's a difficult pill to swallow, but it's real. But in the end, I'll say some improvement is better than no improvement. Do I have any more time, or do you want me to quit? 2 minutes. Whoa. One of the points that's mentioned at the end of the book, and I think is that when you mentioned a couple of things. I mean, sometimes it's hard to say whether we should have more choice or less choice. In some places, it said, for example, well, the choices in some places like Boston, Chicago are much better than the choices in Mobile, Alabama. Does that mean we should be more like Alabama or more like Boston and Chicago? We know that people don't have enough information, even if they do have information. Does that mean we should not have choice, or does that mean we should give them more information? One of the things the standards movement is doing is giving us a lot of information, and the chancellor in New York made a speech last week saying no more report cards, which were, I wouldn't say they were confusing, they were probably invalid because scores kept going up and down, and no educator looks at that and says, this makes sense, this is not real. So what they're trying to do is find ways to identify schools and to show school performance, which every parent would want to know about the child, where their child goes to school. And so it's true we need to keep doing that. I'm not sure if the lack of information about charter schools is no worse than the lack of information about regular schools. We need more information. I'll close at this. There was some polling done, and you asked some parents who sent their kids to charter schools and some parents who sent their kids to district schools, and whether they like their kids' schools. And overwhelmingly, the parents of the charter schools say we like them, and overwhelmingly, the parents who sent their kids to the district schools responded not only with negativity, but in terms of even anger. There's something in that. I think we need to pay attention to that. And that's not isolated, because all the research I've seen, and I've seen a lot of it, on any kind of choice programs shows that parents whose kids go to choice schools, however they define vouchers, charters, magnet schools, are happier with the outcome, or happier with what they have. Finally, there's nothing. Did you want me to stop? Finally, there's nothing in here about performance. What's better? And that's a complicated question. We've had this conversation in this room before. I'll stop.
Well, I certainly appreciate those thoughtful comments and invigorating. And I think that I think one of the challenges is what can you say from a research project or a series of research projects, which always have defined limits. But what I come away from, particularly from my own work, is I'm not sure we need more information, because what I see schools are being turned upside down to create information which parents aren't using. So I think that we could say, why do we need more information? After all, it's like how it's been being against apple pie here. Everyone's in favor of more information. But I think that this issue of how are people using the information, how are they actually making decisions? And I think the fact that charter schools have a halo, schools have a reputation which is often constructed by many people. And I would just love to see studies by sociologists and others who have a clear and agreed upon standard of what makes a good school, independent of the students who attend the school. And I don't think that we have a lot of clear consensus about that issue. And I think that also makes it more challenging.
So let me press you on one clear difference here and ask if it is a difference.
Okay.
The closest you came to a normative claim, I think, was that we really need to create more integrated neighborhoods, because then you would get a less, my word, not yours, less of an apartheid going on in terms of the options, the school options.
Right.
And I think the question goes to, is that a point about the quality of life in general for those who could live in those neighborhoods, or is it a point about the quality of the schools? Because the argument on the other side would be, A, it's somewhat utopian, but B, the issue should really be judged on whether the result of that would be better schools. That is, schools in which students have the opportunity to learn more effectively. And it's a cliche, and that one would like a more imaginative definition of success, but learn effectively and move on to college options or good careers.
Right. Well, I think that Sean Reardon has done research which has shown that economic inequality in terms of where kids are living in neighborhoods has grown, and now we have a gap, by economic gap that's now bigger than the race gap, and in terms of performance.
Right.
And I think other studies have shown that if you put low achieving kids and kids who are poor tend to be lower achieving in general than kids from middle class families, but not completely. if you put low-achieving kids in classrooms with kids who are more high-performing, that you can get benefits for the kids, the low-achieving kids. And so that is the reason why I would say that having economically diverse schools could be potentially useful.
Okay, so let me ask the same question to you, Joe. I mean, again, in terms of policy, you have folks in this city who are absolutely embracing 100% minority schools and trying to make them outstanding. And you have folks who really would prefer a community-based approach that works to create more integrated communities. Is it a stark choice? Should we work on both? This came up the other day, and it's coming up again and again in this space because it cuts very deep.
Yes.
It cuts deep to this idea of whether the school can be its own world. Yeah. And we can create a world in the school that is academically outstanding, almost in contrast to what may be going on outside its gates. Or that's a fool's errand at scale. It may happen in an individual school, but it's a fool's errand at scale. We have to rethink our basic ways of living together. Joe?
I think that it would be better for lots of reasons to have integrated communities, not just in terms of education. I think it's a wonderful thing to try to achieve. Probably, if you're really serious about it, you have to do it in the housing field, not in the education field, and the education will follow. We haven't been very successful for that,
right.
And that's why you have parents and community groups saying, well, we'll go with an all-black school. They don't have a choice. And I remember I worked with Ron Edmonds, who did a lot of work on effective schools. And Ron would say, we can't wait until we have more white kids in this school to make it work better. We have to make it work better with the kids who are here. So it's a different, there are what we strive for and then dealing with the reality of what is. One of the things that's changing in the debate, you cite Riedern's data. Riedern is showing there's more, I think one of the most amazing pieces of research that he's produced shows that there's actually more correlation now in terms of income and performance rather than race and performance, which is very interesting. Yeah. I don't know what we do with it, but it's news, that's for sure. There's a debate about integration that's changing also, not only, and Rick Kallenberg, who was in this salon not too long ago having a conversation with us, is talking about integration by income, which legally is probably easy to achieve now with this court and the way the laws are being interpreted. So to me, I think those efforts should continue, but I don't think we should wait until they succeed.
Okay. Let me go to one of the hearts of the argument about choice, and that is that parents who have some kind of choice, even if it's among a very modest group of schools judged by performance, feel more invested in that school, and that ultimately that's an educational value that is compared to just it's the one nearest. And I'm going there because, well, there it is, right? It's the 5-minute walk, it's the 10-minute walk, which turns out to have some correlation with disconnectedness, which has some correlation with performance, because the students mirror the disinvestment in the school, right? It hasn't got. Now, one could say, well, that's because we disinvested in the neighborhood school because all the glamour is somewhere else, right? Or one could say that there's something in this. Is the act, given the culture, given this is the United States, and it may not be true in other cultures, but given this culture, is there something to the notion that we have to activate that sense of this is mine?
Well, I think that one of the most insidious aspects of the charter school is it stigmatized public schools as being unattractive, and that the schools, which are in fact quite good schools, I think, often don't have the same halo because they're not charter schools, and so they have to work harder to be considered legitimate. And so I feel like the charter movement is delegitimizing public education as the second best system. And this is, you see this particularly in special education, since the resources for are special and it's very expensive, then you often having kids not in private schools and even less in charter schools. And I do think there's evidence of charter schools creaming. And so to me, the issue is that the solution is to make every school, of course, a good school. But charter schools, in my mind, charter schools should be doing much better than they're doing. Given that they, I think, probably have some kind of selection bias for people. You have to work to get them, you have to apply for them. And I always am astounded that these charter school data come out, and there's like some that are excellent, there's some that are doing worse, and some are okay, and I'm like, they should be, in my mind, they should be doing much better than they're doing. And so I worry that, I think a lot of research, including my own research, has shown class has an impact on how parents see their role in schools. And working class parents who are high school dropouts or high school graduates, 15% of Americans are functionally illiterate, sometimes cannot read the words in the handouts that come home from elementary school and don't know the words in a second grade test, are depending on educators to educate their children. So they don't think that they have a role, that what they do in terms of coming to a school event matters, because they think education is under the control of the teachers. And so to expect all parents to be involved is in some ways buying into a middle class vision of what parent involvement should be. And I think that working class parents can be very invested in their schools and still not volunteer for the school play.
I don't think anybody who supports choice at this point is that naive to think that all parents can make good choices. But I do think there is a lot of evidence that lots of parents have exercised choices. And I don't know if charter schools are skimming. I think charter schools are very recent. And so we say they're skimming, we say they're segregated, well, not me, but others. People don't go to charter schools if their kids are doing well in the schools that they started out with. So people who seek out charter schools and other kinds of institutions are people whose children are not doing that well. They're not maybe the worst performance or the ones that you would say are incapable of making intelligent choices, but they're certainly not privileged. If you want to look at this fold out historically, that may yet come. Middle class people, the people in Greenwich are not looking for charter schools. But if the performance of charter schools keeps getting better, that will be something we have to deal with. Because then the middle class people, who again, better equipped to make those choices, are going to say, hey, I'm going to send my kid to that school.
That's happening in the Upper West Side.
And it's happening in some cases. So that's kind of a next generation. But this is very complicated. This is not, there's all kinds of things being thrown around about segregated charter schools. I mean, they're segregated. They're not really segregated. There's comparisons made to the South. I mean, schools that people choose, I'm not saying you said that, are very different from the schools of the Old South, where people were not allowed to go to school because of their skin color. And so we need to get beyond that kind of rhetoric and have an intelligent conversation and say, what's working here and what's not, what's good and what's not, and stop seeing it as a thing of charter schools or choice versus public education. I think we need to get out of that mindset, because neither will work well if you can't do both of them together.
We all three of us, perhaps agree that where $80,000 a student was paid per student by a public school district in Long Island, Fire Island, and a few miles away we had school districts spending $9,000 a student, and wealthy districts taxing themselves at X, and poor districts taxing themselves at 5X, and generating 10% of the per pupil income, is a system of school funding that I cannot explain to anyone outside this country. I just can't. I mean, they cannot believe it. Is at the heart of all of this, have we built a system of public education funding that makes the choice argument, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, almost unavoidable? In other words, having failed to create a structure that actually funds public schools reasonably, right? It's almost as if the field is cleared for the best, the worst, and the government may give us.
But there are states such as North Carolina where there's an even per pupil expenditure throughout the whole state, and you still have a choice issue. And I guess in some ways I do disagree with you, Joe, because I think because the charter schools have come in and there's a new system where people see them as higher status no matter what, without any information, they just presume that they're better. And all the parents I interviewed presumed that they were better. Then I think they are seen as more highly desirable than the neighborhood school, regardless of how the quality of the neighborhood school. Without ever visiting the neighborhood school, the working class African American parents I interviewed told me that the charter schools were better than the neighborhood school.
Well, we have information on this, and what the information tells us is they're no worse. All the comparisons of charter schools, we had Margaret Raywood here a while ago, say that and it's disappointing to people who support choice, that the performance is very similar, and then there are pockets of success. We've had a good run in New York. In New York City, the charter schools are doing better than they are in most parts of the country. And so the choices there say charter schools are stigmatizing public schools. There's a lot of evidence that many public schools are not working. And so I don't think you can blame the charter schools for that perception. Charter schools gives people who have no choices more choices. And it's hard for me looking at this kind of almost philosophically as a social scientist to say, who has all the kinds of privileges we have, to say, well, and we all have choices, and our kids have choices, to not support a policy that gives people who have no choices more choices. It just, to me, fundamentally, as an issue of fundamental equity, it's hard for me to come up with a reason why we shouldn't, because we're the guys who've been running these schools, and we're the ones who've been assigning kids, either when we've had an opportunity to make policy or influence policy or have a voice, and we haven't done a very good job. Let's face it. There are a lot of kids stuck in failing schools. So what's the danger? What's the problem of saying, let's allow parents who have very few choices, very few opportunities to make some choices for their kid? And I agree, we should give them more information. We should help them use the information better. There's lots of things we can do to improve it. But I don't see choice as the problem here.
One last effort, and then I'm going to open it up. In Switzerland, it would be rather bizarre to ask for more railway systems, right? Because the Swiss railroad system is arguably the best in the world.
Yes.
In America, it would presumably not be irrational to ask for an alternative to Amtrak. Right? More choices might make sense, because Amtrak, just for the sake of argument, is so bad that any choice would be of some value. I think we've got and I'll close this and then pose one more question. I think we've got a bit of a chicken and egg argument here. That is have we legitimized choice because the public school system is so problematic for the worst off? Or have we just illegitimately given up on the public system and therefore simply legitimized choice? And I'm not sure that we're going to settle that right now. The last question I would want to ask is very different. It goes to this culture and the families not necessarily wanting to be consumers of information, no matter what class they come from, which I found to be one of the most provocative things in the presentation. When I was commissioner, I would say to middle-class suburban families, your students are not doing well. They're really not doing well. On any international comparison, by their income, they're doing very badly. In fact, worse than the poor students comparatively to other poor students. They will come home and live in your home. And I was already resisted. My successor, who made this actually more transparent than even I had done, I shifted the cut scores on the tests, and many more people didn't pass. And then John King did it again, and this time lots of middle-class parents had children failing, and people started screaming, not at their children, but at John King. So the question I'm asking is, what is it about the culture, and this seems to be irrespective of class, which is, I think, one of the most powerful conclusions you drew. What is it about our culture that we don't want to know the truth about the educational realities? Is it because we're too frightened to find out that it's bad, and we just think we can't do anything about it, either about the school or about our child?
Right. Well, American society has gone through a lot of changes in the last 40 years. I mean, children read less, and parents read less. All of us, newspapers are dying, and people spend less time reading. And we've always had a notion in America as a whole child. And so we have extracurricular activities are very important in our college exams. And I have a doctoral student who is doing research in China, another one in Korea, and their days start at 8 in the morning and they go till 10 at night in high schools. And the time they spend on task is quite a lot. And so you see that but for American society that would be unthinkable.
Right.
To have our kids, and they criticize that they're robots, they're not creative enough, and they need more extracurricular activities, they need leisure. And then even in colleges, you find college students are spending fewer hours working. Now, of course, people used to have to type papers and walk to the library, so there's some discount on that. But I think there's still some clear effort that people are working, they weren't working as hard. In the meantime, in the workplace, people are working harder. They're spending more and more hours in the workplace. So why, but people are, I do think we have this notion of fragile, vulnerable children who need to be protected from excessive demands. And every kid did get a trophy in many of these organized activities. And parents are hostile to the idea that kids would be humiliated. And some people think that's why soccer has become so much more popular, because compared to Little League. Because in Little League you can strike out and you can miss a ball and you can be shown that you've failed, while soccer is more of a group activity and you don't show up as much if you're bad at something. And middle-class parents are all about protecting their kids from looking bad and not having failure in that way. And so I do think we've seen a cultural change in that regard.
Yeah, I'm telling the truth.
I think parents don't want to hear that kids aren't doing well because they think it's a reflection on them and they think they're not good parents.
But why do Japanese parents actually seem to enjoy
Because
hearing?
they're not Americans. But the point I want to make is, and Jack Koontz has written a wonderful essay on this. Just think about that. Think of yourself as your kid is in a school and your kid is doing well and you feel some responsibility to help your kid. So think what it's like for the parent whose kid is stuck in a failing school and has no choice. It's a terrible thing to have to experience. We don't experience that, really, but parents do. And that's, again, to me, another dimension of the choice conversation about empowering parents and making them feel that they can do something to help their kids.
Questions? Go ahead.
All three. Probably more for Joe. If you believe in choice, particularly
It's on.
to deal with what's going on in terms of hopelessness in low-income neighborhoods, the charter school movement up till now, I know in New York, has been almost focused on access should be for low-income neighborhoods. Now the question is coming, should we allow charter schools in middle-class neighborhoods. And I'm curious your thoughts from the choice perspective on that issue.
Well, I've always seen, and I'm probably in a minority on this, I'm always seen choice as a way to enhance opportunity. So I'm not, well, I can't oppose it because I'd sound like a hypocrite, but I'm not that enthusiastic about giving more choices to people who have the choices already. To me, if you're going to look at it from an egalitarian point of view, which is the way I look at it, I'm more concerned with giving more choices to people who don't have them.
Questions? Oh, I think I can't get terribly excited about whether the Upper West Side parent has, one more good school to choose from. I do get excited about the fact that the performance of the children of that Upper West Side family is pretty mediocre. And it would be interesting to me only in the sense that if the charter school in that neighborhood demands a great deal more and begins to show what an international standard education looks like, we probably need more of that in front of us, not so as we get even more despairing about our lowest performing schools, but just because we aren't in fact telling ourselves the truth at any class level about where we are educationally. Yes. Behind you.
Oh, thank you. One comment that Professor Lareau made early on was that we have very little evidence of effective schools for poor kids, or schools that somehow make a difference no matter what their population is. And it seems to me that that's the selectivity bias, the selection bias question is the elephant in the room. And until we absolutely address the question of how is it that kids get sorted among schools in a way that approximates something approaching randomness, then we're not talking at all about serious issues. I'd like to hear a response.
Well, very quickly, there's a chart, I wish we could pull it up, the technology should be able to do this, that we used in the department, which does a scatter diagram of school performance, and then on the other axis is income, right? And absolutely you're right. There's no question that the clusters follow the line, right? So you're going to get more high-performing results from wealthier schools. What's stunning is that you get quite a few wealthy neighborhood schools that are bad, and you get some schools in very impoverished neighborhoods that do outstanding work, both charter and non-charter. And so people react in one of two ways to this. Either they say, well, look at the preponderance of results. Until we address this distribution, we're going to get nowhere. Or they say, look, there are these schools that are way outperforming their demographics. Surely we can replicate, scale those schools, because if we have to wait until we're all equal economically, socially, in integrated neighborhoods, we'll all be dead, right? I mean, quite seriously. So that's the frame of the debate. And I think that applies to whether it's charter or non-charter, right? It's not a question that necessarily divides those two. And unfortunately, we've got two camps. We've got the sort of Richard Rothstein camp that says until you address fundamental inequality, forget really seriously trying to improve education. And then we've got the camp that says there's no point in worrying about social inequality because it'll never change. And therefore, we're going to focus on this school with these 200 kids and we're going to beat the roof off the results. And I think that bifurcation hasn't been very helpful to most kids. But do you want to?
Well, I think that the reality is we're always going to have public schools because public schools are, among other things, for special needs kids. And so I think what disturbs me about charter schools is I feel that they are sapping resources from the public schools. And that in part because you have where I live in Philadelphia, of course now it's gone up like crazy, but now 25 or about a quarter or a third of kids are in charter schools. And so then you have this big investment in these buildings and teachers, so you have to close schools and you have kids getting in. I think David Harding's book about showing when kids cross into new neighborhoods and new high schools and they're from other neighborhoods that it's very dangerous for them. And so you have increased violence, some people think, with high school closures. And so you have all these ramifications that the charter schools movement in throughout the community, which go beyond the school itself. And so I think it has, to me, the view is if schools could be as good as hospitals. Hospitals are relatively similar. There's not the same variability in hospitals as in schools. And that's because of regulation.
Yes. Oh, we got a microphone coming.
Ms. Lareau, by chance, when you were interviewing parents in the lower class communities or lower class families, did any information come to you that explains why it's so difficult to get a decent percentage of those parents to come to parent meetings at schools?
Well, all of those parents love their children very much, and they all want their kids to do well. And they defined the factors that would help their children to do well in school as outside of their control. They thought, just as you go to work, and at work happens at work, they felt that the educational success of their children was dependent on what the teacher did and what happened in schools. And they saw themselves as not very well-educated people, and they didn't want to teach their children wrong. And so they had a notion of professional expertise, and they did not have a notion that they could help their children in any meaningful way. And then sometimes they said, well, I read to their child all the time, but what they meant by all the time was maybe twice a year for 10 minutes. And what the teachers meant was every day, twice a day. So I think they wanted their children to succeed, but they had a different definition about how you go about it.
Very interesting. Yeah.
On behalf of the American public education system, I always feel compelled to invoke Gerald Bracy, who did a lot of research on how when the international test scores are done, they're looking at all of the American population. They really don't get separated to college-bound and tech, and at least until middle school and often in high school, whereas in Europe, they're doing it in 4th grade and sometimes sooner, and in Asia as well. So I always feel compelled to speak up on that point, and I would be curious to hear what you have to say in response to that. But I wanted to push back, as David Steiner would say, to Professor Vitoriti on the idea that we don't need to separate out the market-oriented charter people from the opportunity-oriented, and that these two things are on parallel tracks now, and we may as well accept it, is my takeaway from what you were saying. And I don't think we can get away from the way the market-oriented charter movement is handling the movement. Reed Hastings of Netflix is on video as saying he wants to see everything a charter school within 30 years, no more school boards, and that means every charter school would have its own board of directors, presumably with some hedge fund managers on it, as if we had that many. And so what you would have are all these schools in which no parent has any input, because that's a big problem with the charter school.
Market versus.
Well, they're different. First of all, there are different perspectives that people like me who write a lot about this, those of us, the market people, really believe in no governmental role at all. They think the market will fix things. They don't believe in government holding schools accountable. As far as who's winning in the choice, nobody's ever asked that question as a Googler. I don't think they're winning. The voucher programs that were designed to target poor kids. Vouchers, tax credits are all allocated to kids who are at a certain income level. So they're not winning that battle. If it were up to them, everybody, read Milton Friedman, everybody would have a voucher. It's not working. What we've done in public education in the charter school world, we've actually done a more of a market approach because they're open to, well, it's a lottery, but anybody can apply. And when you look at magnet schools, we know that magnet schools are there to improve opportunities for poor kids. They don't always work out that way, but that was the concept. And so I don't know if they're winning it. I mean, and we still have 70% of the schools are district schools. I think one of the things that both will agree is we need more opportunities for choice. And by the way, that doesn't mean that it should only come from people who support charter schools or vouchers even. You can have more choices offered by the public school system too. And if they're not doing it, it's their failure. In fact, they are doing it. They're maybe not doing it enough, but we have small high schools now. We're breaking up big schools. You know, the market people will say that's because of competition. The standards people will say that's because of standards. And people who work in public schools will say that's because we're trying to do a better job. I don't really care who wins that argument, but we are seeing more options within the public sphere also, the traditional public sphere, and I think that's good.
Quickly on your point, Andrea Schleier, who's the head of OECD and runs the PISA, has a kind of 10-year argument about this, which he engages in because it's a point that's made by smart people. I think there's no quick answer to it, except, now I'm going to sound like my old self as a professor, is to actually read the stuff and make your own judgment. I'm persuaded that there are a couple of cases, Singapore, arguably, China seems to be counted 5 times, depending on which particular Taipei, right? So I would discount some of that. I think in general, what is striking once you do become a more educated consumer of that data, which you must, I agree with you, is that when you make all of the exceptions and all the provisos and you look at who's being tested, and I think the conclusion is still the same. Let me give you one quick example. It was an argument against PISA that American school children were failing disproportionately the math exam because they hadn't studied the concepts that were on the exam. And the concepts that were on the exam were chosen because an international research around what was on track for first-year college would require that information. So you either said, well, the test's unfair because the American kids haven't studied this, or you say to yourself, the test is fair, what's unfair is what the American education system is doing to the child. And both arguments are empirically correct. It's the old story of, damned lies and statistics. You have to be an intelligent consumer. But I think a person who doesn't come to it with a predetermined view would probably leave saying we do demand less of more of our children than many, many of our fellow countries. And the proof of that is that our college-going rates, which used to be the top in the world, almost every year, comparatively, are weakening against other countries. In the back? Yeah.
I'm curious about, so that Annette has articulated that there's this similarity across class in that all classes rely on networks when making choice. But I'm curious whether or not that still means that maybe the reasoning or some of the emotions behind that are the same, and that just because a working class or a lower income parent may not feel that they are an educational expert for their child, do they feel that they know how to decide who is an educational expert? So you don't want to make the decisions for your neurosurgeon, but that doesn't mean that you didn't necessarily have some criteria for which neurosurgeon you were going to, whereas maybe an upper middle class parent is just relying on the fact of the assumption that, my wealthy network is going to know a best school. And so I guess I'm wondering if you've looked into discrepancies then within that pattern.
Within the city parents, it was really only the middle class parents who looked at test scores. And in general, the working class parents, white or black, did not look at test scores. And many of the working class parents, especially the African American parents, were deeply religious. And so they wanted their children to go to a religious charter school. And the one that they actually, that a number of them mentioned to us, it actually was under investigation for fraud. But they all described it in glowing terms because they had heard it was a good school. And so if people were going to do research, they mostly had a college education to do research.
Very quickly, last question.
Just a comment on a question. The InsideSchools.org website, which gives all kinds of information, allows parents to post questions. The most common question is, does the school require uniforms? And the second most common question is, can my child bring his cell phone to school? But in lieu of choice, the mayor's policy is to open 45 community schools, the goal of opening 100 community schools. Is that a better option than building richer choice programs?
It's a yes or no.
I don't know if I can answer that question.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Joe? Yes.
I think it's a good option. I don't know if it's a better option. I think it's a good idea. I think we need more experimentation with that. I don't think it should be either or. I think it should do both.
My quick answer is it depends on the caliber of the people it attracts to the schools. By caliber, I mean the teachers and the principal and the professionals. I suspect that with all the work we've done on the charter sector, that has attracted some kinds of talent and excluded other kinds of talent. Not every talented teacher wants the charter school model. And there are plenty of them who are placed in schools that they want to be better. If they are attracted as a group to these new schools and make them outstanding, fantastic. I want to thank both of our speakers for a very, very thoughtful conversation.